this is Jay Smith here in the Jay Show. It's good to have you here in London. I've brought back our good expert on slavery, Sarah Foster. This is our third episode looking at this question, the slavery question. This is a question that you have always heard growing up was only uniquely a European problem, a Christian problem. Muslims have come to you many times and said, why are you a Christian? You're a black. You don't know what the Christians did to black people, how that slavery is uniquely a Christian problem. This is what you've been brought up with. You've had to try to answer it. You went back and looked at some research, and you've come up with all kinds of new research that shows that this is not a European problem uniquely. In fact, the Europeans only had 400 years of slavery, basically from the 1400s up into the 1800s. You now found out that Islam has had a much bigger slave problem, still has a slave problem from the 7th century right up until modern day. It still exists today. They really have not had an abolition movement. The abolition of slavery still doesn't exist in Islamic countries, as we're going to find out. It still continues. Yeah. And so you have gone back to do research on this, and you've gone to Gambia, one of the places, the countries that is really lives on the whole slavery issue. Their whole economy is dependent on the slave trade today for those who have come back to redress it, to find their identity in Africa again. So let's unpack now some of the treatment of slavery. We've gone and looked at some of the references to slavery. We've looked at some of the quotations of people who are in Islam, what they've said about black people, horrendous quotes that you found from Ibn Sina and Ibn Khaldun. We've looked at where it all began. Bernard Lewis helped us to go back and show that this comes out of a small tradition, just few references in the Talmudic tradition. 0.0006% of the entire Talmudic tradition talk about this character Ham, who we know is one of the sons of Noah, who supposedly copulated with a dog, and that's where the blackness came from. They got the wrong man doing the wrong thing at the wrong time in the wrong place, because the curse then supposedly that came upon Ham had nothing to do with Ham, had to do with Cush, and so in Canaan. And so you can see that they didn't look at the Bible, they didn't look at the other Talmudic traditions. This was only one reference, two references really, that they use as their authority. And this is what Islam always does, doesn't it? It tends to go back not to history, it tends to go back whatever is closest to hand. And this looked like it was closest to hand. We've seen this over and over again with the Quran. All the stories in the Quran are not the same stories we have in our Bible. You can see they've not gone back to the Bible to find the right stories. They've got the wrong people doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. There's Abraham being thrown into a fiery pit in Surah 21. We know Abraham had nothing to do with the fiery pit. It was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that had that. And this is typical of the Quran. It's typical of Islam. They don't have a sense of history. They didn't understand history. They used whoever was at hand, and they took their stories as, well, we would say gospel truth, as Quranic truth, which in reality is anything but. And that's why it's great now that you're now looking back and showing that this tradition of Ham, his evilness, this blackness, is where then many of the Sahaba, those who were around Muhammad, how they start coming out with this notion that black people were evil, that the whole coloration of the black skin is something to be sinful, evil. It's in the Quran in Surah 3, Ayah 106. And so you can see in Surah 39 also, it talks about that those who go to hell have black faces, those that go to heaven have white faces. So it's endemic in the Quran itself. It's right there embedded into the very fabric of the revelation that all Muslims are dependent on. And now we're going to go back and say, well then, if this is so, we should not be surprised the way they treated black people. Yeah. So let's look at this treatment of black slaves. And you've got some material on that as well, don't you? Yeah,
we're going to go deeper into the treatment. We're going to go deeper into the Islamic sources. We're going to really unpack them. But we're just touching on some of these issues because some of my Muslim friends, wonderful friends, they're aware that there is slavery. Slavery is allowed in Islam. We see in many places, we're going to come into it in subsequent episodes, where it says, in order to repudiate your sins, you sell a slave. They know Muhammad has had slaves. And so they say, but it's different from the transatlantic slavery. We have to treat them well. We have to give them the same food that we eat. We have to dress them the same way that we're dressed. It was more humane. Really, they were part of our family and we were looking after them. So this is another thing that I've heard where some of my Muslim friends who do know about slavery say, well, the slavery was a lot more benign, a lot more loving than it was in the West.
They weren't really slaves, they were part of the family.
They were a part of the family. They were a part of the family.
It's
and
that romantic view of slavery. Where does that come from? Because does that fit the historical record?
Well, so that's what we're looking at now. John Azuma, a professor here in the UK.
Dr. John Azuma did his doctoral thesis on this very issue, didn't he?
Yeah, he looked at Arab Islamic slavery and the legacy that it left in Africa. He notes this. He says, in areas like North Africa and the Middle East and Turkey, black slaves did the meanest and hardest work. So there was a differentiation between this colour of the slaves that they had, and it was always the black slaves that did the meanest and hardest work. They were the ones who, well, we'll see it here. He goes on to say in the first generation, and plantation slaves in Muslim lands was as harsh and as cruel as in any other such system. So he's saying that the claim that slavery, Islamic slavery, was a lot more benign, a lot more loving, where it's just part of the family, he says it's not true at all. In the harshest systems that you've seen around the world, Islamic slavery was just as harsh as that in some areas, just as harsh. And it goes on, Tabari, in the 10th century, when we mentioned him before, he talks about Zanj revolts. So this is the Zanj people, the Africans on the east coast who were taken as slaves. They actually revolted because the treatment was so bad. Now, if you were treated as part of the family, you know, given the same food, the same clothes, are you going to go and revolt?
No.
You wouldn't.
No.
You wouldn't. But because they were treated so harshly, it says that they were employed in groups between 500 to 5,000 men. So this is not part of the family, is it? These are people working on the land, and it was the hardest land. These were the salt marshes in southern Iraq in some places. Really hard, demeaning, degrading work. We wouldn't really put people out there anymore. We'd get machines to do that. But this is where they put 500 to 5,000 of Zanj people and made them work in these really hard conditions. Even Tabari says their condition was extremely bad. They were literally pinned down there, hopeless and homeless. Now, this is not a loving situation, is it, for the black people there?
And in fact, look at the date that these revolts began in 689. We're talking about the 7th century. So almost immediately, if it was so benign, then why, we're talking about within 60 years of Muhammad's death, you have these revolts happening. You don't revolt if you're enjoying it, if you're part of the family, if you're eating the same food as everybody else, if you're nothing more than an employed servant.
Yeah, so this is just after the Rashidun period. This is when Islam is expanding, its influence is going out from Arabia, out into Iraq, into all these Arab countries.
This is the Umayyad Caliphate. We've now moved in. We're now coming up to the time period, actually, 689. We're now into the period of Abd al-Malik.
In this period, when we're seeing Islam spread, which is meant to be, as my Muslim friends tell me, treat people in a loving way, we're seeing people revolts.
This seems to suggest, therefore, this is redactionism. They are redacting what they would like to see, what they would want to see today. And they do mean it. And most Muslims that you've talked to do want slaves to be treated well.
I have wonderful Muslim friends who are loving and would hate any of this, would never treat anybody this way.
What we're finding is an awful lot of what Muslims believe today just does not fit the historical record. That's why it's so good what you're doing, Sarah. You're actually going back to see what really did happen. Something that any scholar should do. Something that Muslims need to do. We're doing it for you, but please check up our sources. If we are wrong, throw it at us, hang us with it, because we're quoting your sources. We're going back to your earliest traditions. This is going back to the 7th century, and we're finding that this was not the case. They did not treat them nicely. Let's go back and see what Lewis says. We talked about in the last episode.
Yeah.
He is one of the formative scholars on Islam today. What does he say?
He says white slaves were rarely used for rough labor and filled higher positions in domestic and administrative employment. So there's a clear distinction between the type of work that white people did, white slaves did, and the type of work that black slaves did. And notice how we're even using that terminology now. Colour has been fixed. There's white slaves and now there's black slaves. The white slaves don't do the hard labour.
And comes up all the time, this superiority of the Arabs.
Yes.
The idea that Arabs are at the top of the pole. They are, God is up here. Then comes the Khalif, which must be from the Arabs, must be chosen from the ulama, which would be only Arabs. The ulama would be the religious scholars, the Sahaba, the very beginning. And this is a very big dispute as to between the Shiites and the Sunni, and who should this be? But it's very clear that the Arabs are the next rung. And then you have the Jews and the Christians. Well, you have the Ummah, which would be the believers underneath that. But then underneath that would be the Jews and Christians, even below the believers. And at the very bottom would be the Kafirs. So this idea of Arab superiority. Let's go back to the tafsir. Let's go back to Al-Tabari. We've mentioned him many times before because he's the first to write down the tafsir and the takhriq, which would be the commentaries and the histories. There's a strong hierarchy. My Muslim friends tell me this all the time. The Arabs today see that they believe they own the world, and they treat the other Muslims, Filipinos especially, tell me this. When they're working as maids, they're not treated as maids. They're treated as slaves even today.
I've had numerous conversations with black Muslims, and they're like, when are you going to become a Muslim? And I said, even after Islam, it does nothing for the hearts. I said, you know how Arabs treat you. Even in Islamic countries, you know how you're treated. And they never deny it. They say, yeah, but that's just the Arabs. They never deny
that. And where does that come from? Well, let's go back to Al-Tabari. Because Tabari says that, doesn't he? Let's go ahead and look at the quote that he has here.
He says, Arabs are the most noble people in lineage, the most prominent and the best in deeds. We were the first to respond to the call of the prophets. We are Allah's helpers and the viziers of his messengers. We fight the people until they believe in Allah. He who believes in Allah and his messenger has protected his life and possessions from us. As for one who disbelieves, we will fight him forever in Allah's cause. Killing him is no small matter to us.
Oh dear.
There's so many things you can unpack from this quote. And we're just looking at the Arab superiority, but the fact that they want to fight until you believe, we don't see that anywhere in the Bible.
No, isn't this? I mean, this is so different than everything that we've come across. It's difficult even to listen to this because it seems to me that there is a racial superiority built into this.
One of the verses that I love in the Bible, I can't remember the reference right now, but it's, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought.
Yeah.
And if everyone obeyed that, then we would serve one another. We would love one another. We would realize that each of us are made in the image of God. So I must respect you because God has made you. God has made you special. I cannot dominate you. Who am I to dominate you? God has made you. And so if people kept with that, we wouldn't find things like this. We certainly wouldn't find people saying the Arabs are superior, or the Jews are superior, black people are superior, white people are superior. We look at each other through the eyes of Christ, through the eyes of God, and we see that all of us are made in his image.
Isn't that lovely? Because you talk about these Arabs, these earliest Sahaba, they're ones, the companions, who saw themselves as superior, different. The equivalent would be Paul. Paul would certainly be a Sahaba of all Sahabas because he was a Jew of all Jews. Yeah. He was part of the Shama school. He was a scholar.
Highly educated by the best
He could take on anybody, and he knew his scripture. That's why we love to read the book of Romans. You can't get a better theological treatise than the book of Romans. And yet this Jew amongst Jews, one of the greatest of all the Jewish scholars, and well respected because of his theological background. Look and see what he says in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Yeah. For there is no difference between man or woman, Jew or Greek, slave or free. All are equal in Jesus Christ. Ooh, I love Paul. Of all people, you would have thought he would have been said about Jews above everybody else. I'm a Jew. You would have thought he would be the first to be the best of all Jews and would have wanted them to retain that Jewish tradition. But no, he said, no, there's no difference. Jew or Gentile, we are all equal in Jesus Christ. Yes. There is no iota of any inkling of this idea of some group are superior to others.
No.
We are all the priesthood of all believers. Doesn't matter what race, doesn't matter what background we come from. And you remember Philip going to the Ethiopian, the eunuch. He had no problem with him being a black.
It wasn't an issue. We're going to look at that when we go into the Bible, how the Bible deals with color and deals with race.
Ooh, I can't wait. It gets me excited as we get closer and closer to the Bible. But we still got to deal with this, and we need to look at this attitude of blackness. So let's go back to the 8th century and 9th century. This attitude in literature of blackness. Let's go to Jahiz of Basra, and let's go up on screen this quote. Go ahead and unpack this.
I love this quote because it lays out so clearly the position before Islam and the position after Islam. So Jahiz says this. He says he's a black poet, and he's saying, "It is part of your ignorance," he's speaking to Arab Muslims, "that at the time of heathendom..."
That's the Jahiliyyah period. They always talk about the period of ignorance, that they despise it.
Yeah.
And yet he's looking at that period.
Yeah, he says, "At that time, you regarded us as good enough to marry your women."
So in the Jahiliyyah period, we were
fine.
good enough to marry your women.
So the black
men, he's a black man.
The black man can marry the Arab woman. It was absolutely fine. Yet, when the justice of Islam came, you considered this wrong.
Oh, wow. I mean, this is telling right there. Here's a man that's living at that time, looking about what he came from, looking and seeing that back then, we could marry your women.
Yeah.
You had no problem. But now that Islam has come, that's a closed door. You wouldn't ever let us look at them.
Wow.
Look what Islam has done to the black person. And, we've talked about this, about when we look at women in Islam, Beth has brought this out.
Yes.
When she talks about how before Islam came, you have Khadija is an example of women in the Jahiliyyah period.
Businesswoman, strong woman. She was the one who proposed to Muhammad.
That's right. She controlled Muhammad, employed him.
And Muhammad only had one wife at the time. She was his only wife.
Would not allow him to marry another wife.
No.
That showed her control. That is pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah women. But once she died, then he started proliferating, and he had up to 12 wives. So obviously, this idea of Jahiliyyah period, they call it a period of ignorance. We would say it's the other way around.
Black people at the time said the period of ignorance was better. Better than what Islam has brought.
They were equal to Arabs. They were equal to whites. They were equal to all of the race. There was not this racial tone, as you brought up in the earlier episode. There was no idea of coloration in that period.
Because color was fluid.
It was fluid, as you said, and the quotes show that. But now he is saying, look at the dates. This is the 8th and 9th century. So he's still in the early periods of Islam. He's saying back in that period, we could marry your women. Now we can't even touch them. What an indictment against Islam.
What a change. A change for the worst.
It's gone downhill. And we have seen this over and over again. Islam does not ennoble. Islam does not bring good. Actually, Islam eradicates nobleness and brings about evil, especially when it comes to the whole idea of coloration. Let's look at Muhammad himself. This is something I had never seen before until you introduced this to me. And I thank you for this, Sarah. I've always thought Muhammad, who is Muhammad? Well, he's the paradigm for all people. So therefore, he is the model for all people. And of course, everything you hear about Muhammad, he was the best husband, the best father, the best warrior, the best lover, the best in every category. He is superlative because he's
the example for all mankind.
Exactly.
That's what
and
the
you
Quran
can see a lot of
us.
this is embellishment from oral tradition. But it's what his appearance looked like that really is fascinating.
Yeah.
Now, you've put together a slide here, and we can go to that slide because I want to look at that appearance, unpack that for us as we do it, and put it up on the slide to show exactly how they described Muhammad.
Yeah, so previously we looked at the fact that when it was talking about blackness, it was evil, it was dark, it was unintelligent, but whiteness was pure. And you had black people saying, even on the outside I'm black, but inside I'm white. So there was this desire to be white. So we find in the most authentic hadiths, Sahih Bukhari, volume 4, book 56, number 767, we find that Muhammad had a white leg or a white shank.
White shank, which should be leg, which would be the lower part of the leg. Okay, so he had white legs.
He had a white leg. We find in Sunan Dawood, we find that he had a white forearm.
A white forearm.
Yeah.
White leg, white forearm. Okay.
This is how they were identifying the
Not
prophet.
black, not brown, but white.
It was white. It wasn't brown. It wasn't black. It was white. He had white armpits.
According to Al-Bukhari.
But most authentic hadith, he had white armpits.
Armpits. And that's
very important for people to know.
Volume 8, hadith number 78, 631. Okay.
Sahih Bukhari, volume 4, he had a white belly, a white abdomen.
So he had a white leg, a white forearm, white armpits, and also white abdomen and white belly.
He had white skin. We find that in Mufra. in Al-Dab.
Al-Dab Mufrad, 790, volume 30, Hadith 33 to 37.
He had a handsome white face.
And this is Sahih Muslim, the second after Bukhari in authority of the traditions.
The top two Sahihs.
So 234i.
Sahih Bukhari just lays it out plainly and says he was a white man.
He was a white man.
Muhammad was a white man.
He was a white man. He doesn't make any bones about it. Well,
in the first
excuse me
volume,
for saying bones about it, but you can see white leg, white forearm, white armpits, white abdomen, white skin, handsome white face. He was a white man.
He's a white man.
I never, until you brought this to me, I have never heard this before.
And clearly, this is something that it was important. Allah made sure people recorded, which is, when we look at the Bible and see how that treats color, is a very, very interesting point. But Islam makes sure that we know that Muhammad was white.
Okay. Now, let's go on.
So now, in Sahih Bukhari, we see a hadith where it says he's not completely white. He's white, but he's not completely white in volume 4.
Okay.
But this is the disturbing thing. This is the very disturbing thing. Ibn Musa, he says this. He says, anyone who says that the Prophet was black should be killed.
Oops.
Should be killed.
Should be killed.
Now, Jay, Dr. J, if I call somebody black,
Yeah.
should I be killed because of that?
No.
Why would anybody feel that, do they feel like it's an insult to call someone black?
Obviously, they do here.
Because why would you stipulate that they must be killed?
It was such a grievous thing to be called, especially the Prophet himself.
So can you see the color black is so derogatory that even if you dared to call Muhammad black, you would be killed. You would be. It's not even you would be reproved. Someone would come to you and say, no, actually, he's not black, he's white or he's brown or whatever. That it's not about correction. It's the fact that they want to kill you is the fact that you have insulted him so much, they cannot stand for it. He is not black. Black is associated with evil, with deviltry, with unintelligence. How dare you insult our Prophet? You must be killed.
Oh, that's awful. I mean,
It is.
I mean, that's one of the hardest things to read.
So what does that say about black people now?
Well, yeah, obviously, and so certainly, this must be hard for you to go through. I know, and Sarah, this is a difficult thing because you're black. This is your ancestry. I'm sorry. It is not your ancestry, fortunately. You didn't come from a slave background, from an Islamic slave background. But looking at these kind of comments must be difficult for you to read. And I asked you this when we started these filming. How does it feel for you to read these kind of things? And you responded to me that, well, you've almost become inane to it.
Yeah, I'm kind of numb to it because I grew up, looking at the transatlantic slave trade and looking at the trans-Saharan. But as I was reading through these comments, and especially the parts where they didn't even bother tell people about what they thought would lead to salvation because they didn't think anything of them, it did cause tears. And just the lack of value for human life is just disgraceful. And nothing I recognize that would come from the Bible at all. And so, yeah, I guess I would ask Muslims, please look into these sources. You know, if you think that we're lying, please check it out. We're giving you references. We'd love to be proved wrong, but unfortunately, history tells us different. Let's
do a quick summary of colorism before we end off here. We have about another 3 minutes to go. Number one, go ahead and read down through these different summary things.
So what we've seen so far is that around about the time of the death of Muhammad, we see that color is fixed. It used to be fluid. People's colors would change depending on their environment. It would be comparative, so you would compare them to what was around. But now it became fixed: black, white, red, yellow, brown. And along with the fixing of color came values attached to that color. So if you were black, it was inferiority. If you were white, you had more, intelligence, things like that. And there's certain books, actually, we're probably going to go into it as we progress, that tells you what type of slave you have based on their color. It will tell you their characteristics based on their color. We also saw that through the wrong interpretation of the Bible, through not actually going to the Jewish books, the actual Jewish Bible, through not going to the actual Christian Bibles, but through listening to stories, they had a complete misreading. Whoever wrote the Quran completely misread the story of Ham and Noah and Shem and attributed the curse of blackness and slavery to something that God put on Ham, which is something that we don't find in the Bible at all. And based on that wrong idea, based on that wrong ideology, the consequences were that black Africans were seen as suitable for slavery because Allah himself had sanctioned it. This is completely wrong and completely regrettable, and has led to the death and suffering of countless millions. And we also saw that the Islamic sources taught the superiority of lighter shades over darker slaves, but at the top of it we saw were Arabs. But what was most disturbing, that even though we know that Muhammad was an Arab, he wasn't even considered brown, as we know that the Arabs were, or a bit darker than white. He had to be considered a white man, or not completely white, but not completely white. And worst of all, if you dared to call him black, you should be killed.
Should be killed. Now we're going to just end by looking up at this graph that you've put together here, looking at the comparisons. On the left side, you have the Islamic slave raids in Africa. Go ahead and unpack that, comparing it with the transatlantic slave trade. So on the left side would be the Islamic slave versus the European slave.
Yeah, these are the things that we're going to continue to unpack. We're going to look at the New World slavery, so the transatlantic compared to the trans-Saharan. Mainly men were taken to the Americas because of the work, whereas mainly women were taken to the trans-Saharan because of the harems.
So in the European slave trade, they took them right over to the Americas because they have huge plantations.
Yeah, the sugar
plantations
fields.
need an awful lot of manual labor, and that's why they brought them over there. They brought them as families so they could procreate, so they could have children to continue the slaves, to increase the number of slaves. So it was in their best interest to make sure that the families were maintained.
Yes.
Men and women would work. Men and women also would procreate. Whereas in the Islamic slave, there were no plantations. They didn't need men.
No.
They needed mostly women.
Very few plantations, and it was mainly women, just so that they could have a harem.
For sex, and also as the slave girls to take care of the household.
Yes.
The only men they really needed were eunuchs. We're going to get into that, and it's terrible what we've heard about the eunuchs, what John Azuma's found. That's not for today. We're going to get to that later on, but we're going to just put this up there. We're going to start with this in the next episode, doing a comparison. We're going to move on from there and start looking at some of what we now know about the slave trade, doing comparisons between the two.
We're going to look at Europe, we're going to look at Asia, we're going to go into all of this. We're going to look at the abolition struggles, what it looked like in the transatlantic to what it looked like in the trans-Saharan. And we're going to consider the fact that the transatlantic was stopped just under 400 years, where the trans-Saharan lasted for at least 1,300 years and still goes on.
And still goes on today. Listen, this has been an awful lot to unpack. We know that an awful lot of this is new for you, especially you Muslims. You've never come across this before. It's difficult to hear. We know that probably some of you are getting upset, but please don't get upset with Sarah or me. We're not the ones that are actually trying to impose on you. What we're saying is, when you look at history, make sure that you look at it correctly. When you have these viewpoints, and you do, many Muslims have these viewpoints concerning their own past. An awful lot of it is not based on history. What Sarah has done is to go back to history to find out whether or not the suppositions that you have been brought up with were accurate. And what we're finding out, they were not accurate. An awful lot needs to be yet unpacked. We have much to share with you. Stay with us. This is Dr. J. Smith here in London with Sarah Foster. It's been great to have you, and we want to see you back again. This is Jayden, over and out.